to explain. So this is how we address a verse like that. Now, before we examine the criteria for an imam, let's briefly talk about the shura over here. Because you will find other schools of thought, when it comes to the position of imamah, of who's an imam, they will tell you that we have the principles of shura mentioned in the Quran. Therefore, when it comes to choosing the imam or the khalifa or the successor, the Quran has instructed us to engage in shura. What does shura mean in English? Consultation. Meaning you, the ummah, gather and decide who the imam would be. We have to address this very important argument that other schools of thought have mentioned. Before we examine these two verses of shura, we have a very valid question here. If the way to choose the imam and the khalifa is by shura, then why is it that none of the first three caliphs became caliphs through shura? How is it that you're teaching Muslims in history that you guys need to choose your imam through consultation, but none of the first three caliphs were actually chosen through this system of consultation? Isn't that a joke? Let's briefly elaborate on that. As for the first Khalifa Abu Bakr, he was not chosen by shura. Initially, 5 pledged him allegiance. Then they intimidated others to follow. You think there was a referendum in Medina? Oh, people come. Let's do a shura and choose, this next Khalifa. No, a group of people, they happened to gather under the tent of Saqifa, and it just quickly happened. What about other villages and neighboring areas? How come they had no part in this shura? He was clearly not appointed by the shura. And the biggest proof that it wasn't shura, in Bukhari and other sources, when Umar ibn al-Khattab, when he describes how Abu Bakr was appointed, when he describes the first caliphate, you know what word does he use to describe it? Falta. What does falta mean? Slip. Something that suddenly happens without preparation. That's the meaning of falta. And he says, faltatun waqallahu sharraha. God really protected us from the slip. Wait a minute. Why are you describing the caliphate of Abu Bakr using a word like that? Does that mean there was really shura and it was an instruction of the Quran? Or it's something that you guys cooked and suddenly happened? And he says, Umar, this should not be repeated again. It's a falta, it should not be repeated again. Wait a minute, if it's a Quranic principle, why don't you want it to be repeated again? In fact, you should tell Muslims, just like we chose our first Khalifa, you guys should do the same. We don't see that. In fact, if Abu Bakr's caliphate and how he was chosen was according to the principles of Quran, then those who selected him like Umar should come out and proudly say, yes, that is how you choose a Khalifa and you teach the new generation of Muslims to do the same. That's something you should be proud of. This is something you should teach other generation of Muslims. But do we find that? No. Instead, what do we find? No, he's like, it was, a falta. It was a slip. It was something that just happened without any preparation, and it should not be repeated again. And that's why they did not repeat it again. That's the second argument here. How was the second Khalifa chosen? He was appointed by who? What happened to the Shura? Where's the Shura? Just threw it out the window? What happened to the Shura? Third Khalifa, how was he appointed?
6 members.
By 6 people. How many Muslims were there in the Muslim Ummah? Thousands? Tens of thousands by that time? Why only these 6? Who came up with this criteria anyway, that you only have these 6 people? What kind of shura is this? And by the way, if really choosing the Khalifa is supposed to be through shura and consultation, don't you think the Prophet ﷺ should have explained to us what are the limits of this shura? Who's involved in it? Who's qualified? Who should be part of it? He just leaves it open-ended like that? At least tell us. Do the people of Medina count? Do we have to ask other villages? Okay, in Medina, you've got thousands of people. Who's qualified to be part of that shura? Everybody? All companions? Half of the companions? Those with these qualities? I mean, when you go to any country, to any organization, and they have an election system, in their bylaws, they have rulings on how this election is to be conducted, right? Do you find an institution which says, yeah, you should have elections, but I don't have a way for you to conduct elections. I don't know, just go and do it however you want. That's a joke. So if really it was shura, how come we don't see the Prophet explaining to us the procedure? So that in itself tells us khilafah and imamah is not by shura. And the biggest proof is that those first three caliphs, they did not even implement shura when it came to their khilafah. They want others to implement them. You guys should be role models for Muslims. If you didn't implement the shura, other Muslims are going to implement the shura. And that's exactly why throughout history you have dictatorships in the Muslim ummah. Where's the shura? Because those three set the precedent that it's by dictatorship. It's not by shura. That's a problem.